to introduce our distinguished speaker for today. And I think this person was the perfect person to start off this talk series. Dr. Andrew J. Hoffman, Andy, is the Holcim Professor of Sustainable Enterprise at the University of Michigan. And he holds joint appointments at the University of Michigan, both the Stephen M. Ross School of Business appointment and then the School of Natural Resources and Environment as well. He serves as the director of the Frederick A. and Martha M. Erb Institute for Global and Sustainable Enterprise. Many years ago, he received his interdepartmental PhD at MIT and the Sloan School of Management and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Most of us have a PhD just in one field. He has it in two, and he works across multiple disciplines as well. He's published about 100 articles, and then he's also published over a dozen books. 5 of these books have been translated into other languages. One of these books, and I suggest that you read all of them, they're great. There's one on carpentry, believe it or not, because he's a carpenter. The one book that I skimmed recently was Flourishing, a frank conversation about sustainability, the book that he co-authored with a person at MIT. A little bit about his research here, because I want to let him talk about the research, not me, but just a few highlights. He's written extensively about the evolution of field pressures related to environmental issues, the corporate responses that have emerged out of that, and then also some of the cultural underpinnings of climate change and so on, and social and psychological barriers there as well. He has a number of honors, and we'd be here all afternoon if we talked about all those honors, but just to name a few, he has the JMI Breaking the Frame Award, a Maggie Award, which was awarded just this last year, Aldo Leopold Fellowship, and many, many others. His work has been covered extensively in the media, including Time Magazine, he's been on NPR, and then the Wall Street Journal as well. And then just on a more personal note, prior to academics, he had an interest in older cars. We were talking about this at lunch, and he still does. He knows all about the engines of MG cars and so on, and older Chevy trucks and so on. And on that note, I can't think of a better way to kick off our first presentation today by someone who's very interdisciplinary in life and in research. Thank you for coming today, Andy.
I'm going to try and do this without a mic. Can you hear me in the back of the room? Is that projecting on that? Is this too noisy?
It'd be better with a mic.
It would be better with a mic?
Yeah, please.
How's that? Is that better?
Fabulous.
Okay, great. Here, we do this. I feel like I'm getting a pin. And I just want to let you know that if the screen is shaking, this is not your eyes. If you're starting to develop vertigo, I suggest you look down at the floor and take a few deep breaths and then come back. But thank you, Teeny, and thank you, Martha, for having me on JP. This wonderful invitation. It's good to leave Michigan and the cold and the winter that just won't end, and enjoy this beautiful warm weather in this stunning beautiful campus. I have no idea what to expect. It's a beautiful place. So, I'm going to talk about climate change. I'm going to try and make it entertaining as well as informative. I think it's a curious thing when people talk about communicating an issue, and yet the communication style leaves you kind of cold and tired. So I'm trying to mix it up. Trying to demonstrate or practice a little of what I preach. So I'm going to start with a story, and I will end with a story. And the theme that you tell someone what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. I will bookmark, or bookend my talk with 2 stories. And the first is what got me started in this particular research stream. And it starts back in 2010. The University of Michigan Development Office called me up and said, we have a potential donor, would you meet with them? University of Michigan is very good at raising money. If you haven't seen in the news, they're on a new capital campaign, and they've announced a target. They never announce a target unless they can hit it, and the target is $4.5 billion. So they have an amazing development machine. This often happens that we have someone who's possibly interested in sustainability. We meet with them, and we'll see if we can reel in this this big whale. He used to be on a football team and then made a lot of money in a different area. I always have to put a caveat there because no, it's not Tom Brady. It wasn't Tom Brady. So the only time I could meet with this gentleman was 7 o'clock in the morning. And I showed up at a conference room at the top of the business school with a cup of coffee in my hand, sat down, still waking up. And this potential donor started the conversation by saying, I think the scientific review process is corrupt. That sort of jarred me awake. And I said, well, what do you think of a university based on that system? He says, I think the university is corrupt as well. This was the opening conversation. He continued to say why he thought the science around climate change was a hoax, and we talked about that for a while, sunspots and solar flares. And then he turned his attention on me and said, you teach environmental issues in a business school, can you tell me why you hate capitalism and why you want to destroy the market? This is going someplace, and it's not in market. I say that with seriousness. We knocked that around for a little while, and then he said, do you know why Earth Day is on the day it's on? And then I'd become a little cautious at this point, and I said, no, can you tell me why Earth Day is on the day it's on? And he said, it's because it's Karl Marx's birthday. It is actually that is American made before. It's not Karl Marx, though. It was Lenin. Lenin's birthday. He has his Marxism and stuff. But I turned to the development officer and I said, can you tell me what our agenda here is this morning? And the potential donor said, I want to buy you a ticket to the Heartland Conference, which is the primary climate skeptics conference in the country. And I politely declined, having a conflict, and the meeting ended. And I left, and I was pretty angry. I felt like there was a bait and switch. I felt like this was sort of targeted at me. And then through the day, the more I talked to people and the more I thought about it, the more I became intrigued. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized he had a coherent worldview. All these pieces fit together. He saw this in a coherent way. And I wanted to understand what that way was. He had a different viewpoint than I did. He had a different worldview than I did. It led him to a different conclusion. And I wanted to understand what that meant. And it also was fascinating to me because he clearly came to evangelize me. He came to try and show me a different way of looking at things. And with that, I became fascinated. Because that's what he studies, cultures and institutions and how they change. And within that conversation, you can find the elements of the talk I'm about to give around the science, the social science around people's beliefs on climate change. And so I use that as a setup. Going from there, I found something quite curious. Oops, I have to turn this on. There you go. If you look, I'm going to show you two divergent trends, which, aside from the content of them, I find quite fascinating. So we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Their most recent report, it's been on the news, just came out. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 50s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and ocean have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, sea level has risen, and the concentration of greenhouse gases have increased. It goes on to say that humans are doing this. Now, here's a scientific body, and you can see they've done it in successively more urgent forms. And this latest report came out, and the New York Times wrote an editorial, and they said, maybe now the climate skeptics will stop saying it's not true. Now, I'm going to give you the synopsis of my talk right now. The New York Times editorial is headed dead wrong. Because scientists can keep on giving more data and more analysis, that's not what the debate is about. It's about clashing worldviews, it's about different belief systems, about a whole host of things which I'll get into. But if you don't recognize this subtext, then you will never get anywhere in this debate. It is about clashing worldviews. It's a cultural schism, I call it. And so the IPCC can keep on coming out with reports. It is not what the public debate is about. It is not what the challenge or the resistance to the science is all about. That's the thrust of my talk. But continuing on this idea of divergent trends, we have the IPCC. It comes out with a report. It comes out with successor reports. The conclusions, the consensus statement, and I presume this whole audience knows how the IPCC works. It doesn't actually have scientists. It's a bunch of volunteers, about 2,000 scientists, and they gather all the scientific literature and they come up with a consensus statement. What does the literature say? And they say that this is, that it's happening and humans are causing it. Their consensus statement has been endorsed by almost 200 scientific agencies around the world, including every one of the G8+5 countries. If you look at surveys of practicing climate scientists, it's very important, practicing climate scientists, not just any scientist, practicing climate scientists is important. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial last year signed by 16 scientists that said that climate change is not real. One of them was a Margaret professor at Wharton. One of them was a research science at ExxonMobil. You had a whole range of different disciplines, but practicing climate scientists, and you can see the numbers up there of how many of them believe that climate change is happening and we are causing it. You can go further looking at the literature. And these surveys of the literature, the most recent is the one on the top, saying that 97.1% of the abstracts out there between 1991 and 2011 endorse the consensus position of the IPCC. Going even further, the two primary scientific bodies in this country, the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Academies of Science, both use the word consensus to describe the state of the science around climate change. Whether you believe in climate change or not, just from a sociological point of view, there's marker number one. We've got the scientific establishment that said this is real. The other side is that belief in science and climate change declined from 71 to 57% between 2008 and 2009. So there's a disconnect between the public belief and the scientific position on this issue. It has come up in recent years. It's back up to 67% by 2012. And I'll give away a little bit here, but that decline in 2008-2009 corresponds with ClimateGate. And ClimateGate really drew down people's belief and trust in the IPCC and the work of climate scientists. And then the increase now, Barry Ray and Boric, they have pulled people, finding that number coming back up. They ask them what drives their position on climate change, and it's the weather. It's the weird weather that's starting to get people to start to come back up and say, maybe climate change is real. But there's data point one, still, there's a disconnect. Even more interestingly, in terms of supporting that position, the disconnect continues. The majority of people actually do not believe that scientists think that global warming is happening. They don't see a scientific consensus. It's an important data point because people's endorsement of belief in climate change is directly connected, in many cases, to their belief that scientists think that it's happening, and they don't. They don't notice. So, there is an interesting sort of split, and there's where I begin my work. How can this be? And the work I'm doing, you could be looking at nanotech, you could be looking at GMOs, you could be looking at nuclear power. You have positions of the scientific establishment, and then you have a public discourse at complete variance to where the science stands on this issue. And on all these issues, the processes are very similar. And I'll explain in some depth what those are. Now, to get us there, and to think about climate change as a cultural issue, not as a scientific issue, but as a cultural issue, I want to draw the distinction between a scientific consensus and a social consensus. A scientific consensus forms from a body of scientists using peer review, publishing in journals, going to conferences, and coming together using a certain methodology, a scientific method, and certain markers of quality, statistical analysis and so forth, good methodology to come up with answers. That's how the scientific community comes up with a consensus. The social community, the social consensus, has a much wider array of participants. You may not like it, but politicians matter in the public debate, clergy matter, radio show pundits matter, movie stars matter. They all come together in the public debate. They all do not use the scientific method to come to their conclusions. Very often they use more emotional means. Jonathan Haidt has some nice work on the way we process complex information. And what he likes to point out is very often we have an emotional reaction right away. That is very fast. We have a very fast emotional reaction. Reasoning comes in later. So he describes what we do when we're faced with these kinds of complex issues. We act more like lawyers than scientists because we've already formed an opinion. It's very fast, and we look for data to support that position as we go along. And so when we look at the social consensus, it involves a much wider array of actors and a much different set of considerations and processes to get there. So I use the analogy of cigarettes and human health. For decades, scientists said that cigarettes cause cancer. And for decades, the American public rejected that viewpoint. They even went so far as to believe that cigarettes were actually good for you. And these are some ads from the 50s. More scientists and educators smoke Kent with a micronite filter. More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarettes. And this was the dominant logic of the day, that cigarettes are actually good for you. And over time, through a social and, I might add, a legal process, we came to the conclusion, we have a social consensus today that cigarettes cause cancer. How do you know you have a social consensus? It's because we teach young people that this is the correct way to think about the world around us. I'm willing to bet that if your son or daughter came home smoking on a Camel, you would sit them down and say, do you understand what you're doing? This is really unwise, this is unhealthy. I'm willing to bet that if your son or daughter's friend came over to the house smoking a Camel, you might do the same thing. That's how you know you have a social consensus. You teach it to others. It's the right way to think. And we have come out at the point where there's a social consensus around cigarette smoking and cancer. On climate change, we're on the left side. We have a scientific consensus. The process has begun. And again, projecting forward, the public debate over climate change really didn't begin until 1997 with the Kyoto Treaty. So we've been at this debate for about 15 years. It's going to take some time because, as I'm going to point out, the cultural shift to accept that climate change is real is actually quite massive and much larger than to accept that cigarettes cause cancer. So it's going to take some time, and we're going to get into that. So if we think about climate change as a cultural issue, how do people process it? How do they make sense out of it? So I'm going to walk through, this is my most social sciencey slide, so don't worry, let me walk through it. But we use what's called motivated reasoning. We have a worldview, and if there's an idea that comes along that challenges that worldview, that perspective, then we will try and reach a conclusion that supports our worldview, and we will be resistant to the information that is coming to us. In a simple way, for example, I was telling Teeny that I took out my MG, and it wouldn't start. So my first thought is, it's going to be something really simple because I don't want to pay a lot of money. I'm using motivated reasoning. I'm not looking at problems. I want to find something simple. Climate change is an issue that we use motivated reasoning as well. For some of you, it may be intuitive. Of course we're changing the climate. For some of you, this is a crazy idea. We're not changing the climate. And we are looking at this through filters of motivated reasoning. Dan Kahan at Yale introduced the idea of cultural cognition. And that idea is that we form the filters by which we use motivated reasoning by the communities of which we're a part. The referent groups with which we associate. You guys are here in the university, you associate with a certain referent group called academics. And that leads you to a certain conclusion. Your referent group may be your church, it may be your community, it may be the workplace you go to. If you are immersed in a conversation with an inherent worldview, you will adopt it. No one is the supreme individual that can resist the pressures of the world around it. So I try and teach that to my students when they're looking at a company they're going to work for. Do they have the values that are going to fit? Because sooner or later you will adopt those values. And so that plays out in our minds through the communities of which you're a part as well. Now, it doesn't mean that we're just blowing in the wind. It doesn't mean that we're flip-flopping. We act with bounded rationality. Herbert Simon came up with this in 1957. Economics presumes complete rationality, and he says, no, we're boundedly rational. There's only so much information we can grab. We have so much cognitive capacity to interpret it, and therefore we deviate from rationality in some actually fairly predictable ways. We're boundedly rational. Or you can go to the marketing literature and they describe us as cognitive misers. And that means that you have a certain amount of time and energy to try and figure something out, use your cognitive abilities, and you're miserly with it. So when you go to the grocery store, I like this example. The first time I went to an organic grocery store, I approached the cereal aisle, and I was faced with a wall of cereals, and I didn't recognize a single one. And it was really upsetting, because I like to just go grab my Cheerios. I know where it is, I don't have to think. And so the amount of energy I had to use to apply to try and figure this out was really challenging. And this is, it starts to come in a lot of the green marketing work. You know, Walmart has started this thing called the Sustainability Consortium, where they want to put a green label on every single product, every single SKU in the store. I think they're out of their minds. Because can you picture, you know, a mother with a screaming kid in the carriage, walking down and reading the label on every product before they buy it. Not a chance. We're cognitive minds. We limit the amount of attention we give to certain issues. And so this last item, we activate black boxes. That's how we get through our day. Max Weber came up with this way back in 1917. I get through my day by activating black boxes. I got on a plane and flew here. I have no idea how the air traffic control system works. I don't know how a jet engine works. I took a car here. I actually rented a car. I was driving and I stopped and thought that was really strangely easy that I have this, you know, $20,000 item that's I'm now driving. I have no idea how that system works. Sometimes we choose not to open black boxes. I hire someone to manage my stocks called a mutual fund manager because I don't want to pick stocks. I prefer that black box to stay closed. We get through our day by activating black boxes. Sometimes we open them, most of the time we don't. If I go to the doctor says you need surgery, I trust the system, cut away. We choose when we want to open them and when we don't. If we didn't do this, we become emotional and psychological cripples. If you can imagine having to, just think about the environment. Where did those clothes come from? Where did that food you ate come from? Is this building green? That's where the lead actually comes in and actually closes the black box for us. We don't have to understand. Just look at the old certification. You don't have the capacity to do it. You just don't. And so we live our days by doing this. This is how we get through our day. So if we look at all that, then we form our opinions on complex scientific issues of which we have limited knowledge. It's very important. Some of us do actually know science. Many of us do not. In fact, most of us do not. The National Academies has come to a conclusion that 3/4 of the American public is scientifically illiterate. That black box is closed and they don't want to open it. And so they make their decisions based on these kinds of processes. They connect it with their personal identity. They connect it with their cultural community. Now here's a very important conclusion from that. Once someone connects it to their cultural identity, hit them with more data, they will dig their heels in even harder. Because if you hit them with more data, what you're telling them is, here's the data, don't you get it? Here's some more. Are you stupid? Here's some more. What is wrong with you? I'm going to hit you with more data, and you don't realize that they may be shutting down for a host of reasons that we'll get to in a second that have nothing to do with the science. And a lot of people within the scientific community really trying to push on the climate change debate are still thinking, as that New York Times editorialist did, let's get one more report from the IPCC and we're going to put this issue to bed. It's not going to happen. The cultural debate is much more complex. It's much more nuanced. So, what does that look like? I think one of the biggest smoking guns to capture the idea that climate change is a cultural issue of clashing worldviews, it's a cultural schism, is you can look at what are the correlates with people's belief on climate change. You can look at the standard ones around the environment. Typically around environmental issues, it's Democrat more than Republican, it's urban more than rural, it's women more than men, it's young more than old, it's educated more than less educated, it's the coast more than the center. On climate change, party affiliation, political party affiliation is the strongest correlate to people's belief on climate change. And so you can look at the work that's out there. On the left there is a study done by Riley Dunlap and Aaron Wright, and they looked over the period of 2001 to 2010, and as you can see on the top, liberals in the blue, conservatives in the red, on the bottom, Democrats in blue, Republicans in the red. You can see this widening gulf. That more and more Republicans are rejecting that climate change is real, more and more Democrats are believing that it's real. Is this because one has better scientific education than the other? Absolutely not. It's because they have different worldviews, and climate change falls into that space. It's part of what we might say is the culture wars in this country, the way abortion and other issues are. Now, we're talking about climate change here, and you can see up on the top, Democrats 78%, this study was in 2011, Republicans 47% believe that climate change is real. More recent work, and this comes from the Pew Research Center, shows that since the bottom of the line in 2009, 2010, it starts to be coming back up a little bit. That gets back to the weather that I talked about before. But still, Republicans, about 50%, don't believe that climate change is real. Motivated reasoning, cultural cognition. Climate change, interestingly, is the conservative right that's against the science. GMOs, it's the liberal left that's against the science. These processes are in play because we connect a whole host of related issues to the issue of climate change. So let's get into that. If climate change is a cultural issue, where does that take us? And that takes us in some interesting directions. Let me start by saying it is not a pollution issue. Despite what the Supreme Court said, that the EPA can regulate CO2 as a pollutant, it is not the same as SOx, NOx, and particulates. SOx, NOx, and particulates are an unwanted byproduct of industrial processes. CO2 is actually something we like. I am exhaling CO2 right now. Plants are inhaling it as part of the natural system. To call it a pollutant, it doesn't work. And in fact, we like more CO2 because more CO2 correlates with an increasing standard of living, because we live in a fossil fuel-based economy. And so more CO2 is actually good. And so it is not a pollution issue. Call it one, and people will start shutting down and saying, what are you talking about? I mean, yeah, I had a student go to work at a company, and she says that this old gentleman came up and said, you want to watch me pollute or contaminate the global environment? I was like, that's, so it's not a pollution issue. What is it? Well, it's an existential challenge to our worldviews. Now, that's a big mouthful, and it sounds quite grandiose. But let me ask you the fundamental question around climate change, the fundamental cultural question around climate change, and it is this. Do you believe that we as a species have grown to such numbers and our technology to such power that we can alter the global climate? Think about that question for a second. Because if you answer that question in the affirmative, you can just change the moral order that many people have in their brain. And it challenges some really deep fundamental values that they hold. It changes things like our sense of ethics. If you answer that question right, or in the affirmative, then you're mowing your lawn here in Merced, California as import for the poor people of Bangladesh. You think we're ready for that kind of a global ethic? Think again. What do we do about it? Well, we should have some kind of a intrusion in the market. We should alter the price of fossil fuels. Oh, really? Okay. Now you can start to see we're getting into some tricky territory about faith in the market. And how should we do that? Well, we should do it on a global scale. Well, who should do that? Well, maybe the UN will do it. And if you haven't seen the red button I've just hit, think again, because people start to hear global governance, they start to hear one world government, they start to shut down. So that's what we're dealing with here, is deeper values. So what are those values at play? What are the cultural values that people hear when they hear the words climate change? Let's start to talk about that. First, I will start by saying that I actually ended up taking up my potential donor's invitation to go to the Heartland Conference. Actually, it wasn't me, it was one of my doctoral students. She heard this offer and she was, I want to go. And she went and she interviewed people and she listened to the talks and she read the material. And what she wanted to find, what we looked at were what are the dominant frames that were being used at this conference. And number one was a deep suspicion of the political ideology of climate proponents, namely environmentalists. They don't trust environmentalists. Environmentalists, to their minds, are ultra-left, socialist, borderline communists that want to use the government to control our lives. Naomi Oreskes, in her book Emergence of Doubt, which is down here in the bottom, says that in this community they refer to environmentalists as watermelons. The green on the outside, the red on the inside. This is the way they see it. The AGW believers, that's anthropogenic global warming believers, they hate people and they hate the Western economy. Now, this is not without merit, because some of the extreme environmental voices do put some pretty radical stuff out there. Earth First has a bumper sticker. It says, save the planet, kill yourself. Very extreme environmental groups do have a message that is quite challenging, quite objectionable, and can raise suspicions in a reasonable way. I want to show you these to say there are some reasonable positioning for people to say that climate change isn't real. That's why I told that story at the beginning, and I know it gets a laugh, and I'm probably doing that, but I really want you to grab that there's a reasonable position here. We need to understand that and respect that, and we can debate that. We can debate that. Okay. The second is a very strong trust in the market, and there are numerous studies to show a very strong correlation between faith in the market and disbelief in climate change. And again, because people see, accept climate change, accept an intrusion in the market. I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept that, therefore I'm not going to accept position number one. And there are people out there, Naomi Klein in particular, who's really talked about the idea that climate change really forces us to consider whether we should collapse capitalism. And people start to shut down and say, what are you talking about? No. capitalism has done so amazing thing for us, and it has. Capitalism has raised the standard of living of our society. It has increased our lifespan. If you go back to the 1900s, early 1900s, the life expectancy of an American was 47.9 years. I'd be dead. Why is it longer? Because we have buildings, because we have food, because we have clothing, because of nutrition, all brought about by the market system. And so some people are saying, no, I don't trust this agenda because it's all anti-capitalism. This one is quite interesting. Distrust of scientists, scientific process, and science itself. And I was at a meeting of the National Academies, if you've been there, that big hall filled with scientists, and I said, I got up to the mic and I said that I was talking to an evangelical minister, and he told me, one of the problems with climate change is that its three primary spokesmen have no credibility with the evangelical community: environmentalists, democratic politicians, and scientists. And you can hear the room going. But this is not new. Hofstadter wrote a book in 1964 that won the Pulitzer Prize called Anti-Intellectuals in American Life. So what do people hear or see or think when they say scientists? They think these pointy-headed people that live in this ivory tower, talking about things I can't understand, coming to conclusions that impact my life and have a disproportionate influence on the political process. That scares me. They also see them as people who privilege rational thought over religious faith, efficiency over beauty. They see people whose values are different than their own. And I would add, they also see a liberal left agenda. Now, that second challenge is actually a fair one. There are surveys of college campuses, and the majority of college professors are liberal. I don't know if this comes as a shock to you, but the closest balance is law schools, where it's 4-to-1, liberals to conservative, all the way to history departments, where it's 18-to-1, and everything in between. And so when they see something coming out of the institutions of the academy, they see a left-leaning agenda, and they're not entirely wrong. And that, to me, this became really vividly clear during the administration of George W. Bush years. I would find repeatedly that professors would come to campus and give talks, and sometimes they would end up doing a rip on George W. And I was thinking, they know they're on safe territory. Or I was at a conference, a big conference. I hope it's not George Bush that did. I was at a conference, and I was with some colleagues, and we were in San Antonio, Texas, and they started doing a rip on George, and we stepped outside the doors of the conference center onto the street, and I had to say, guys, we've left the academy. I would suggest you tone it down. So we do live in a particular world, and people distrust it. Some people distrust it. There are other values out there as well. There's a lot of nice work I've cited on the bottom. I'm trying to understand what's going on here. So different conceptions of risk. We all have different risk profiles. Some people choose to ride a motorcycle. Some people still choose to smoke. They make a choice, and they make trade-offs. So on this issue, some people say the environmental risk is too great not to do something. And some people say the economic risk is too great to do something. How do you balance those? And which one do you put on top? You know, Eli Lehrer, who invited me to campus, he runs a very conservative think tank in Washington called Erb Institute. And he will come out and say, look, I think climate change is real. I think it's overblown. But I think we got stronger priorities, like an economy in free fall that we got to fix, a healthcare system. And, you know where he's going on Obamacare. And so he says these are more important issues right now. Climate change is not. He has made a risk decision. We all do it. And so we have different conceptions of risk. We have different conceptions of the value of relationship to nature. Is nature here for our benefit? Or is nature here as something with inherent value? That question actually splits our public very, very deeply. And I'd like to use the example of the Hetch Hetchy Dam. If you know the story of the Hetch Hetchy, which I'm sure all of you do, it's right here. But it really came down to a debate between John Muir and Gifford Pinchot, with Teddy Roosevelt in the middle trying to decide what to do. And to Gifford Pinchot, he said, I don't know what the commotion is. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. We need water. San Francisco just had this fire. Damn thing. Doesn't make any sense. For John Muir, this was a sacrilege. He actually used the analogy, damn Hetch Hetchy, you might as well go to Rome and damn St. Peter's and use a cistern for water. He saw it as the same thing. Teddy Teddy Roosevelt sided with Pinchot. They damned it, but they also since then have not made a similar intrusion into the national park system. So that really did split the country. It was a very big national issue. And people still, today, are debating this issue. Look at the debate over at Anwar. Should we leave it alone, or should we drill for oil? I'm willing to bet that most of us, if not all of us, will never go to Anwar. Many of us may have a opinion. You've been, okay, you're a troublemaker. Okay. You're the exception to all my rules there. But there are many people who just like the idea of leaving it alone. They see it as inherent value. And for some people, it has oil. Let's grill it. It's for our benefit. And it cleaves us. Discomforts with the scenarios of climate change or climate outcomes. This one's really important. A lot of people are putting out these really extreme positions on climate change. You see the day after tomorrow, Manhattan's underwater, glaciers are going down Madison Avenue, and people just start to shut down and say, give me a break, come on. There are two theories at play here, but I would begin by saying that David King at Oxford wrote a book on climate change, and it was a good book. What I like most were two appendices in the back. And he said, here's what climate skeptics say, and this is why they're wrong. Then he says, and here's what climate alarmists say, and this is why they're wrong. And he calls it climate porn. It's titillating, it's exciting, it's meant to excite, and it's false. It's not real. And so when you start to present the most extreme possible outcomes on climate change, people start to shut down, and there are two bodies of literature on this. One is called just world theory. Most of us have an idea that the world is actually a very nice place. I do believe that actually this conference will end. We'll have a nice dinner tonight. The sun will set. It will rise tomorrow. I will enjoy the rest of my trip. I will get back to Ann Arbor. The world is a magnificent place. And when you're saying climate change, it's really you're saying no, this is a step function. And actually it can turn on us. And that is quite interesting. And I would add to that, it's interesting that there are studies to show that if people have been exposed to extreme weather, they're more inclined to believe climate change is real because they see the idea that the weather can turn, and it can turn radically. If they've seen a hurricane or a tornado or a flood, they're more inclined to believe climate change is real because it requires a different view of our just world. The second area is called terror management theory, and the idea that what you're asking people to do is envision something that is quite horrible and gets us to confront our mortality in some very unpleasant ways, and that again, people will avert, they will avoid, they don't want to go there. This is what you're dealing with when you start to bring up climate change. Going further, what is the role of government? That is certainly a salient debate in our country right now. And if you're talking about dealing with climate change, you're going to talk about a carbon price, you're talking about an intrusion of the government into the market system. And we are having this debate in spades right now. No, get the government out of the market, get the government out of our lives. And climate change proponents say, no, bring it further in. And so it triggers that. And then if you were to bring it to the global scene, whether there should be a global governance on a carbon price, now you've got full powers. And then lastly, differing values and notions of morality, and I would put religion in here. For some people, the notion that we are altering the global climate displaces the notion of God and divine providence. We are not in charge out there, God is in charge out there. I got heckled in a talk by someone said, read Genesis. God put nature there for our use. We are the stewards of the environment, it is for our benefit. Went on to say that God promised Noah he wouldn't flood the earth. The notion that the seas are rising is preposterous. Now you're getting into some really tricky territory here. If you're challenging someone's notion of God with a belief in climate change, you're really getting into some deep fundamental values that will not yield easily. Rush Limbaugh dedicated one of his shows to the idea that you can't believe in God and climate change at the same time. They're inconsistent. This belief is out there. This is what you're up against. And so when you find yourself at that Thanksgiving dinner or that Christmas dinner and you're faced with that relative who says climate change is a hoax, do not take out your slide deck and start getting the data. Understand that this is what is on the table and more. This is what you're talking about. And if you don't recognize that, you're going to find yourself in a very unpleasant and hard conversation. So I don't want to stop there because, you know, too much of us just focus on the problem and stop and leave you all depressed. I thought that the moving out an Inconvenient Truth did that. Just said, you know, basically everything stinks and have a good night. So where do we go with it? What do we do with this kind of knowledge? And this is where a lot of the work on decision sciences, cognitive sciences, dispute resolution, negotiations, managerial decision making actually has something to say on where we go. So let's begin by saying there are three possible paths forward. Now, the first is the optimistic path, and that is a path where you don't have to change your beliefs at all. you can keep doing what you're doing and accept that climate change is real. And how do we do that? We develop some killer technology tomorrow that solves a problem so that we don't have to change. You develop energy too cheap to meter, like nuclear power was supposed to be. You develop a carbon-free car. You develop forms of mobility. You do whatever you need to do so that people don't have to change their lifestyle. They don't have to change their beliefs. That's the path we're on. That's what we're hoping for, is technology is going to come and save the day. What's the pessimistic path? Well, that is where people will not change their worldviews and they will attack the other to change theirs. And Roger Pielke talks about this in his book, Inaugural. He describes abortion politics. Two sides are talking about two completely different issues, life and choice. They only look for information that confirms their opinion and disconfirms the other. They even go so far as to demonize the other, even so far as to hurt the other. This is starting to play out on climate change debate now. There are numerous accounts of climate scientists being harassed, being attacked, being threatened. This is playing out. And so we want to avoid the pessimistic path. Or we go towards the consensus-based path, which we start to recognize the subtext of the debate and start to have a conversation not just about the science, but about the values that are underlying it. And this is a very hard road to go, but this is the only way you're going to get there. Well, actually, there are others, and I'm sure you're thinking about that, but we can talk about that. But what I want to do is focus on number 3 and say, what can we do to try and push this debate forward? So here's a list of 8, and there are more tactics that I've just sort of gleaned from the literature and applied to the climate debate. And the first is know your audience. Who are you talking to? At Yale, they have a very nice study. It's called the 6 Americas study. If you haven't seen that, I recommend you look at it. It's a segmentation analysis of the American public. The American public actually doesn't break down into yes or no. There are dismissive and alarmed and then different grades in between. And if you draw a graph of it, it looks like that. It's a skewed distribution. More people that believe it, they're convinced, than are skeptical. But then you've got the 2 poles, the believers. On either side, I would add. My advice is if you find you're talking to a believer, talk about something else. Talk about football. Talk about something else, because they're not there to have a serious conversation. They're there to win. And so you can have this debate, but it's very limited on how far you can go. And so try and ascertain whether it's worth fighting the fight or whether it's time to move on to something else. Secondly, ask the right scientific questions. You can actually start to dig deeper into someone's position on this issue by getting them to break down into its individual components. And there are actually, scientists go crazy when pollsters come up to someone and say, do you believe the anthropogenic global warming is real? Because you've embedded about 6 or 7 questions into one, and it's much more complex than that. So the first 3 are one category, the next 2 are different. The first 3, is CO2 increasing the atmosphere? Yes, it is. The data is extremely clear. CO2 is increasing. You can argue against the hockey stick. You're arguing against some very, very strong data. 2, does this lead to general warming of the planet? Again, yes. The science is quite clear of the greenhouse effect, of what greenhouse gases do to trap heat. Number 3, has the climate changed over the past century? Again, yes. The scientific data is quite clear that the global mean temperature has gone up. So someone can actually debate those 3 points. Again, you're maybe back in the believer territory, but there isn't ground, really very, very strong ground to argue those points. But the next 2, you can actually have a conversation. Number 4, are humans partially responsible for this increase? Scientists have looked at multiple possible hypotheses that have caused this. The only plausible hypothesis they're left with, what they call fingerprint analysis, is humans. If someone says humans aren't doing it, you have to say, well, what's the alternative hypothesis? It's not solar flares, it's not sunspots, it's not volcanic activity. Scientists have looked at these things. The only thing they have is humans. Now, they can't prove causality. Scientists can't do that. They can't say humans directly cause this, but they can show correlation between human increases in CO2 and the elevated temperatures and CO2 levels we're seeing. And then number 5, what will be the environmental and social impact of such change? This scientists are still not sure about. They can draw a distribution curve with the extremes of minimal impact, maximal impact, and then something something in between with a higher probability, but that's what we're dealing with right now. So if someone says the impact's going to be minor, you can say, well, why are you going to one tail of the curve? Someone can say that it's global Armageddon, and you can again say, why are you going to one tail of the curve? The odds are somewhere in the middle, and you can start to have this discussion of what will be the outcome. But scientists right now are not sure. They're still trying to figure out. In fact, that's where a lot of scientific activity is right now. Now, you can ask the right scientific questions, or you can just focus on the scientific consensus. And this is what I'll do. I'm not a climate scientist, but I will come back and say, I trust the scientific establishment. I do. I trust that the National Academies knows what they're doing when they say that there's a scientific consensus. I trust that the scientific literature shows that 97% of the studies say it's happening. That's what I'll fall back on. I trust that every one of the scientific agencies, the G8 plus 5 countries, plus another 193 around the world say this is happening. That's good enough for me. And we'll stop that. And someone can say they don't trust the scientific establishment. I don't know what to do with that. So that's a tack you can take as well. Number 3, move beyond data and models. Recognize the emotionality of this issue. Recognize that there is a lawyer in front of you, not a scientist. They may have an emotional position that drives them to a certain point, and that they are reacting to it in that light. And so start to move beyond. And this also means you don't call someone an idiot. You don't make them feel foolish. Al Gore actually wrote an article in Rolling Stone on climate change. He began by saying, what we've got is on one side right-thinking believers in science, and on the other side corporate cronies and right-wing ideologues. And thank you very much, Al. That was really helpful. That is not the way to provoke a serious conversation. You don't do this by demonizing the person you're talking to. Try and focus on the broader frames. And what I mean by this, is there a way to frame this issue in a way that is palatable to your audience? You need to be multilingual. You need to know who you're speaking to. So I'm in a business school. I teach environmental issues in a business school, and I often give talks to business audiences. And some of them are not very friendly on the issue of climate change. And I gave a talk once to the Michigan Manufacturers Association. And the talk was about to begin, and this guy sat in the front row, and he slapped a book on the table with the title facing me, and it was called The Climate Hoax. He was getting ready. And so I started my talk, and he interrupted. He said that the science isn't clear. And I said, I don't care. The market is shifting. It is driven by regulation, by consumers, by operational issues, by cost of capital. You can be agnostic about the science of climate change and still see it as a business issue. I was using language that the business audience could understand. I wasn't talking about carbon loading or radiative forcing. I was talking about the language that business responds to. And so you need to do that of find broker frames. And so what are some of the broker frames that are out there? A nice example is with the Catholic Church. For years, climate scientists were saying to the Catholic Church, you got to take this issue seriously. And they kept saying, it's the environment. It's really not our thing. And then they finally came and said, it's not the environment. It's an issue of social equity. Because the world's poor are going to be hit first and hardest. And they didn't do it. And the Vatican said, oh, okay, now you got our attention. Now the Vatican's going carbon neutral. You can frame it as an issue of economic competitiveness. This is Thomas Friedman's argument. If we don't develop the technologies in solar and battery storage and wind and geothermal, someone else will. We're going to buy it for now. We need to do this. You can frame it as national security. There's a group called the CNA group. They call it climate change a threat multiplier. It's going to force the U.S. military to have to go into regions to prop up unstable regimes. We're going to have to deal with climate refugees. This is an issue of national security. The last frame I'll mention, and there are more, but there was a nice study that was done to look at multiple frames to find which one worked the best, and the answer they came up with was the health frame. You need to make climate change personal and salient. People will not respond to it as long as it's a theory or a gas they don't understand, and minute, very, very minute changes in global mean temperature with shifts in the weather. The weather is not climate, but if you frame it as health, now you can understand you have an urban center, and increased temperatures cause people to get sick, they die. Who are those people? They're your grandparents and your children. It's the vulnerable populations. And that gets people to start to pay attention, so you can frame it as health. Recognize the power of language. We're getting into teenies area, but words matter. And this was a study I did on the right. I had editorials on climate change over a 3-year period in the entire country. I sorted them up by those that said that climate change is not real, those that said it is. And And then what were the terms they used as they went through? And what you'll find is the two communities are speaking completely different languages. So to begin, on the top is the group that says that climate change is not real. On the bottom is the group that says it is real. Notice on the top, global warming is in big letters. The size of the letters, you know, word size of the letters, the amount is used. On the top, global warming is very big, and climate change is very small, and you can see it further to the left. On the bottom, climate change and global warming are the same size. So in communities that believe climate change is real, the two terms global warming and climate change are synonymous. They do mean different things scientifically. Global warming means temperatures going up, climate change, it is altering the statistical deviation of weather patterns. On the top, you'll find that with groups that don't believe climate change is real, global warming is a much more inflammatory term. They get really angry when they hear that. You know, I took a group of students to the UN meetings in Cancun. I came back, I was interviewed by an editorialist at the Trade Press, and then just sort of this hatchet show and said, what a load of nonsense, how could climate change be happening when it's so cold outside right now? I'm sorry, how could global warming be happening because it's so cold outside? So global warming, you know, you just use that word, you're going to find a different reaction depending on who you're talking to. If you notice on the bottom, a lot of the conversation is about jobs, about green, about the economy, about renewable energy. On the top, you see a lot of terms like alarmist, skepticism, religion, cult. A real derogatory tone on the top. On the top, you'll see in big letters Al Gore. Al Gore is the guy they love to hate. They see Al Gore as someone who's using climate change to make himself rich. So that plays out on the bottom of the time of the study. George W. Bush was in office, but that was the prominent person they chose to attack. But words become politicized. The word green is politicized right now. Start using green tech, green jobs, and people hear, oh, that's more of that liberal government intrusion in the market, picking winners and losers. Climate change has become politicized. We had the CEO of Cargill on campus, and he was talking about how they're changing their growing patterns, but he really did not want to use the C word. He did not want to mention that. He would say, yeah, there's warming, and maybe people would do it, but he has to speak for a certain constituency, and that word is alienating to them. Sustainability has become a very politicized word. Words matter. You can go up to Alberta, and you can talk about tar sands or oil sands. Which term you use just signal to whoever you're speaking to whether you're for it or against it. It's tar sands if you're against it, it's oil sands if you're for it. Use the word climate denier, and watch someone get really heated under the collar. They see that as a veiled reference to Holocaust denial. They don't appreciate that. Some people on the other side don't like the word skeptic, because all scientists are skeptics. And so this word, you know, the words matter, and those are very, very complicated terrain. Find climate brokers. The messenger is as important as the message. I can't say it any simpler than that. I could try and go talk to an evangelical community, but I'm just one of those left-leaning professors from the University of Michigan, the Ann Arbor, the Bachelor of Liberalism, and they're not going to hear me. The best way to get an evangelical to really care about climate change is to hear from another evangelical. The best way to get a Republican to care about it is to hear from another Republican. You need to hear from the business community, you need to hear from actors, and Olympians. It has to be whatever constituent will meet the audience you're trying to reach. People will trust the message if it comes from a source they trust. And the climate broker can be an individual. It can also be a news source. There are studies to show that increasing viewership of Fox News correlates with decreasing belief in climate change. There are correlative studies that show increasing listenership of NPR, increasing belief in climate change. The source of information, the messenger, is as important as the message. We need to recognize that people are part of multiple reference groups. They may say that the science is corrupt on climate change, and yet if they get sick, they go to a hospital. What's that hospital based on? The same scientific review process. So, tricky territory because you're exposing hypocrisy. People like to be consistent. They like to be constant in their beliefs. So it's a challenging territory. And then finally, employ events as leverage for change. And as I said, it's the weather that has really driven a lot of people's beliefs on climate change. Now this is tricky territory as well, because weather is not climate. Weather, you know, and it's very hard to say that the weather out there was caused by climate. Scientists are very, very careful on that ground. Climate change can increase the severity of a storm, it can cause a storm, and you know, so you can get someone's attention on weather, but then we should shift the conversation really fast and say weather is what happens next week. Climate change is what happens over the next 10 or 100 years, and they're very different things. To highlight that point, the difference between weather and climate change, you know, for a lot of insurance companies, they're trying to figure this one out. And insurance works on actuarial tables where past is prologue. They look at the past and then they make their actuarial tables going forward. A number of them are starting to bring in climatologists. Cardinal just hired climatologists. This is significant because climate has changed. Climatologists, climate change is saying it's a new normal. The past is not prologue. There's actually a fundamental shift here. I think about this differently. And that's, to me, a nice marker of the difference between weather and climate. So, those are just what's out there in terms of thinking about this through. To bring this to a close, as I told you, I started with a story, I'm going to end with a story. And it's a lustrous postscript. I started on this direction, you know, as you know, with academics, you start a new stream of research, you write a paper, it's sort of a toe in the water, and then you start to dive in as you go along. And so the first paper I wrote on this was in a journal called Organizational Dynamics, which I'm sure you've all read. I'm actually quite sure you have not. And I had this whole argument laid out, and I had two very small sections that were actually quite small, but I said, I want to draw an analogy here. Two analogies, actually. The first was cigarette smoking and cancer, and I made that point earlier that you have a scientific consensus, it takes a while to create a social consensus. There's another piece of that story that I find quite interesting. A lot of people are saying, until the science is conclusive, we shouldn't do it. But it's fascinating, science on cigarette smoking and cancer is not conclusive. The Surgeon General's report says that we can show you statistically how it can happen, epidemiologically how it will probably happen, but quote unquote, in the end, it's a matter of judgment. There is no direct, science can't do this. I could do a study right now, I probably couldn't, but I could try and do a study, get you all to start smoking. Some of you get sick, some of you won't. I can't guarantee you smoke, you will get cancer. Climate change, climate science does not need to get to that definitive smoking gun before we can do something. Cigarette smoking did as well. So I made that first analogy, and then I said, now how big is the cultural shift before us on climate change? And the second analogy was, it's as big as the abolition of slavery. Tricky territory. So I said, this is my analogy. If you went back to the 17th century, 3/4 of the world's population was enslaved or serfdom. It was the number one source of power. 18th century, I should say. And abolitionists stood on the street corners of London and said, we have to abolish slavery. And people said, you're out of your mind. You're around quality of life. Your entire economy is based on it. Well, today, people are standing on the street corners of London and New York and Shanghai and saying, we have to abolish fossil fuels. And people saying, you're out of your mind. You're going to run around quality of life. The entire economy is based on it. Slavery was supported with the values of the day. It's in the Bible. It was seen as the normal moral order of things. Can you envision a day where people will look at the emission of CO2 with a moral overtone to it if you're contaminating our collective atmosphere? I'll bet you can't. That's how big the shift is before us. It took 100 years to abolish slavery in England. We've been at this for 15 years on climate change. There's my analogy. And the New York Times picked it up. And I thought that was pretty cool. And the Scientific American picked it up. All these journals picked it up. I was getting really hitting, thinking, public intellectuals. This is really cool. And I really loved it. And then a colleague emailed me and said, I see Mark Morano's taking his hits at you. And I said, who's Mark Morano? And he said, I really suggest you go to climatedepot.com right away. And so I went, and this is what I found. And the picture of me on the bottom right, and him on the bottom left, and there's the entire coverage of the article. There is no more. Climate skeptics are more equivalent to those defending slavery. Climate change requires a shift similar to smoking and slavery. And there's my email address. Now, for those academics in the room that would like to get into the public debate, two things I want to point out. One, my secretary track hits to my webpage. And you can see that spike on the right is the New York Times article, and then 4 dots to the right is the climatedepot.com article. Look at the scale. So how many people actually read the New York Times article? How many people actually went to the source article? At most 110. And I know that you have to pay $30 to get it at Organizational Dynamics. You get it free on my webpage. Don't tell Organizational Dynamics that. And so you lose control of the message when it goes out there, and that's what sticks. So there's point number one. Point number two is to come back to the bite of the butt. About 3 months ago, I was invited to moderate a panel, a very private panel, of some very, very high-level business people. And I was really jazzed about doing it until about a week before, someone found that. and said, I don't want Hoffman in the room. He's one of those crazy environmentalists that I was out. So a cautionary tale. As you step into the public debate, you lose your message, and it can linger. I don't think it would have changed anything, but it would have been good to know I was stepping in when I was stepping in. Anyway, there's what's out there, and then the emails start coming in. And you can start to get a taste of what was pouring in there. And at first it really stung, and I didn't know what to do with this, and then I thought, well, I'm a social scientist, so I should code it. And so I started to, and what you will find are the frames that I'm talking about. They're really not attacking climate science. They're really attacking me on some other issues. So skepticism of science and scientific elites. CO2 is plant food. Are you an idiot? It's not food. Your days of milking the system with your phony science number. You self-appointed overseers expect us peasants will take you and your fellow scientists seriously. You are cultural elites. How dare you tell me how to think? I don't trust you, I don't trust your ilk. Or, suspicion of my political ideology. I must be a secular evolutionist. I cannot believe in God if I believe in climate change. I'm eco-imperialist, I'm a green terrorist, I want to enslave people, I'm a racist. Or fear of economic disaster. You know, why do you want to lower the standard of living of the world? Why do you want to develop the world? Or greetings, comrade, Marxist, just when you want Marxist destruction of civilization. Now, I bring these up, and this is my final slide, to just make the final point. What would compel someone to send emails like this to someone they don't know who's writing about a scientific issue? It's because it's not a scientific issue. They're writing to me because they're defending deeply held values that are threatened by the notion of climate change. That is the challenge before us, is getting people to accept these deeper issues and bring the conversation to that level. If we don't do this, we will not really get an understanding, or a public understanding, we will not reach a social consensus. Thank you very much.